Welcome back for another deep dive with us. We've been digging into this piece titled Aquellos que no pueden recordar el pasado.
Oh,
Yeah, it's Spanish
I was gonna say.
for those who cannot remember the past.
Okay.
And it's, got me thinking a lot about how societies can fall prey to these really dangerous ideologies, even advanced ones, right? Like,
Hmm.
why does history seem to repeat itself? This document really digs into that,
Yeah. It's a really relevant topic, especially,
especially now
yeah.
with everything going on.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to kind of unpack this excerpt together. And it starts with this jarring anecdote um, about a group of neo-Nazis in 2024 protesting a performance of The Diary of Anne Frank
Oh, wow.
in Michigan.
Really?
Yeah, something.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
And the author uses this to drive home the point that we might be forgetting, or even worse, dishonoring the memories of those who suffered under similar ideologies in the past.
Yeah. And the author actually opens with that really powerful quote by George Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it."
I feel like I've heard that,
Yeah.
but never really thought about it too deeply. Kind of terrifying when you actually apply it to like everything.
Well, Santayana, he was a Spanish philosopher, and his words have really resonated for decades. And the idea is central to this whole piece.
Okay.
And to kind of bring it to life, the author really paints this picture of this protest in Michigan, these neo-Nazis, they're waving swastika flags,
Wow.
and they're targeting this performance about Anne Frank's experience during the Holocaust.
Hard to believe something like that could even happen in 2024.
Right.
It feels so out of place.
Yeah, you would.
Shouldn't we have learned from the horrors of the past?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly the question that the author is grappling with. What's
Oh.
even more jarring is that they point out that these protesters, they're potentially dishonoring the memories of their own ancestors who fought against Nazism.
Oh, wow. It's almost like history is this distant, irrelevant story to them.
Yeah.
Scary to think that those lessons could be fading.
And this is where the source starts to draw these strong comparisons between what's happening in the US today
Okay.
and the societal climate of Germany in the 1930s.
Right.
And the author doesn't shy away from pointing out the chilling
And let's
similarities.
talk about that. The author mentions things like scapegoating, rhetoric about contamination,
Right.
and the demonization of entire groups.
Yeah, those are all warning signs that the author picks up on.
Oh, okay.
And they argue that these tactics were used in the 1930s in Germany to dehumanize and marginalize groups,
Right.
ultimately paving the way for the horrors of the Holocaust.
It is unsettling to think that we could be seeing echoes of that in today's society.
Yeah, and that's why the author really stresses the perils of forgetting.
Right.
If we don't learn from the past, we risk repeating it. And they specifically point to the rise of extremist ideologies in the US as a potential echo of what happened in Germany.
Interesting, because the source mentions that Germany in the 1930s was a nation known for its intellectual and cultural achievements.
Yeah.
Right. You would think that a society like that would be immune to something like Nazism.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But the author argues that even educated societies can succumb to dangerous ideologies if they lose sight of those lessons of history. And they see this happening in the US today with, the increasing polarization,
Yeah.
spread of misinformation, the rise of extremist groups.
So how did it happen in Germany? What led a nation with such a rich history to fall prey to Nazi ideology?
Well, the author suggests that it was a combination of factors.
Okay.
Economic hardship
Yeah.
after World War I, political instability, and just this longing for strong leadership. All of these things are fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root.
So people were vulnerable, and the Nazis offered them scapegoats
Right.
and simplistic solutions to complex problems.
And the author, they really highlight this concept of the other and how the Nazis effectively used it to manipulate and control the narrative
Okay, so in this context, who or what was the other?
in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
The other was anyone who didn't fit into their very narrow definition of Aryan purity. So Jews, Roma, LGBTQ individuals, political opponents, anyone who they deemed different or a threat to their regime.
That's kind of like what we see today, right? With
Yeah.
certain groups being targeted and demonized.
The author definitely sees that parallel.
Okay.
And they argue that this kind of scapegoating, it's a dangerous tactic used to divide societies and consolidate power. It allows those in power to avoid taking responsibility for problems by blaming the other.
So instead of addressing the real issues, they create an enemy to rally against.
Okay.
It's a distraction, a way to manipulate people through fear and anger.
It's a tactic as old as time, unfortunately,
Yeah.
and very effective.
And if we're not careful, we could be headed down a similar path.
The author seems to think so. They express concern about the fragility of democracy in the U.S.
Right.
and how easily it can be eroded if we allow fear, prejudice, and historical amnesia to take hold.
And that brings us back to this idea of collective amnesia.
Right.
Why do we seem to forget the horrors of the past? I mean, how can we just forget?
That's a really important question, and it's something that the author digs into pretty deeply.
Okay.
We're going to unpack it further a little bit later in this deep dive.
Yeah, let's get into that.
But first, I think it's important to really understand what the author means by collective amnesia and how it plays into this larger discussion of history repeating itself.
All right, let's do it. I'm ready to dive in.
Okay, great. It can be hard to understand how entire societies can just forget these atrocities of the past, you know?
Yeah.
But the author really digs into this whole idea of collective amnesia,
Okay.
and it's fascinating.
So break it down for me. What is collective amnesia? Isn't history, written down?
Right. Well, the author uses the term collective amnesia to describe this societal phenomenon
Okay.
where a group of people essentially forget or they suppress a traumatic or uncomfortable period of their history.
So there's like this shared forgetting
Yeah.
where that painful past is kind of pushed aside.
Right. Either consciously or unconsciously.
Okay.
And it's a really complex process, influenced by things like trauma, social pressure, even political manipulation.
Wow.
Sometimes societies, they just want to move on from a painful past and focus on the present.
Right.
But the author warns that this can be dangerous if it means forgetting the lessons that history has to teach us.
And the source specifically mentions that this forgetting can leave societies vulnerable to repeating those past mistakes.
Exactly.
Almost like we're destined to keep making the same errors over and over again.
And that's where the author draws this direct connection to the rise of extremism in the U.S. today. They're arguing that this collective amnesia about the dangers of extremist ideologies is making us more susceptible to repeating the mistakes of the past.
So forgetting the past allows these dangerous ideologies to kind of creep back in, almost unnoticed.
Yeah, that's the author's point.
Wow.
They argue that we need to actively engage with history, even the painful parts, to recognize those warning signs and prevent history from repeating itself.
And that brings us back to the fragility of democracy in the U.S., which the author seems very concerned about.
Right.
They even explicitly ask, can democracy be lost in the United States? And answer with a resounding yes.
Yeah.
Of unsettling to read that.
It is a sobering thought.
Yeah.
The author's warning us that democracy is not a given, It's something that needs to be actively protected and nurtured.
Okay.
And that requires us to be aware of the threats it faces.
What kinds of threats are they talking about?
Well, they specifically point to the rise of extremist ideologies, the erosion of trust in institutions, and the spread of misinformation as major threats to democratic values.
It's interesting because they highlight the 2024 U.S. presidential election as a prime example.
Yeah.
They argue that the level of support for certain candidates and parties espousing those extreme views is a worrying sign of how susceptible even a democracy like the U.S. can be to manipulation.
Yeah.
So they're saying that even in a system like ours, designed with checks and balances to protect against tyranny, things can still go wrong.
That's right.
Wow.
The author seems to be warning us that democracy is not a spectator sport,
Right.
It requires active participation and a commitment to democratic principles from all citizens.
So we can't just assume that everything will be okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The author seems to be urging us to be vigilant, engage critically with information, challenge those in power, and actively participate in the democratic process.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all of this ties together. Collective amnesia allows us to forget the dangers of those extremist ideologies.
Yes.
And that makes us more vulnerable to their seductive promises,
Exactly.
even in a democratic society like the U.S.
That's a great summation of the author's main point.
Okay.
They argue that we need to be aware of this cycle and break free from it.
But how do we break free?
Yeah.
They mention education as a key factor in combating extremism and preserving democratic values.
Yeah.
But then also point to Germany in the early 20th century as a counterexample.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
The author acknowledges that Germany at the time was a highly educated nation, yet it still fell prey to Nazi ideology.
Right.
So they seem to be suggesting that education alone isn't enough.
So what else do we need?
Well, the author seems to suggest that we need to cultivate these critical thinking skills, media literacy, and a deep understanding of history and its recurring patterns.
Okay.
We need to be able to recognize those warning signs, the subtle erosion of democratic norms, and the insidious spread of intolerance.
It sounds like they're arguing for a more engaged and informed citizenry.
Exactly.
Boy.
They seem to believe that an educated and engaged citizenry is the best defense against extremism and the erosion of democratic values.
Okay, so let's go back to this idea of scapegoating,
Yeah.
which the author argues is a powerful tool used by extremists to gain power and justify their actions.
Right.
Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Well, as we discussed earlier, scapegoating is the act of blaming an individual or a group for something that they may not be responsible for.
Right.
And it's often used to simplify complex issues and create a sense of unity against a common enemy.
Right, and we see this throughout history, don't we? Like the Nazis blaming the Jews for Germany's economic woes.
Exactly. And the author draws a direct parallel between that and the way certain groups are being scapegoated in the U.S. today. They point to the rhetoric used by some politicians and media figures, which often echoes the language of hate and dehumanization employed by the Nazis.
This reminds me of the Michigan protest we talked about earlier. The author points out that the neo-Nazis in that case are likely scapegoating, just like the Nazis did in the 1930s.
That's a really sharp observation.
Yeah.
The author seems to be suggesting that these kinds of incidents are not isolated events, but rather symptoms of a deeper societal problem.
So it's not just about a few extremists protesting a play.
Right.
It's about this broader trend of scapegoating and intolerance that's taking root in society.
That's right.
Wow.
The author argues that this trend is dangerous because it erodes our ability to empathize with others,
Right.
to see them as human beings worthy of respect and dignity.
And that lack of empathy and understanding can lead to all sorts of problems, right?
Absolutely.
From discrimination to violence to even genocide.
The author seems to be warning us that if we allow this trend to continue unchecked, we risk creating a society where entire groups of people are demonized and marginalized, just as we saw in Nazi Germany.
This is all very heavy stuff,
It is.
but I think it's important to talk about these things,
I agree.
even if they're uncomfortable.
The author clearly feels that this is a conversation we need to be having.
Right.
And they seem to believe that understanding the mechanisms of scapegoating and recognizing its dangers is a crucial step in combating it.
So how do we recognize those dangers? What are some warning signs that we should be looking out for?
Well, the author points to several things, including the use of dehumanizing language,
Right.
the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories,
Okay.
and the tendency to simplify complex problems by blaming a single group or individual.
These are all things that we see happening around us today, aren't they?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
And that's why the author's message is so urgent.
Okay.
They're saying that we can't afford to ignore these warning signs.
Right.
We need to be aware of them, understand how they work, and actively resist them.
This is all very thought-provoking, but it also feels a bit overwhelming.
I understand.
What can we do as individuals to push back against these trends? I mean, is there any hope?
I think there's always hope, but it requires, action and awareness on our part.
Okay, well, let's dive into that. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into those who cannot remember the past. We've talked about these unsettling parallels between contemporary America and 1930s Germany, the dangers of scapegoating, the fragility of democracy, and this whole idea of collective amnesia, where societies kind of just forget the lessons of the past.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, no doubt. But the author doesn't just leave us hanging, with a bleak outlook. They seem to believe we can break these cycles,
Okay.
but it requires awareness and action.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
The author doesn't give us this step-by-step guide.
Right.
What can we actually do? Where do we even begin if we're feeling overwhelmed by all this?
Well, they really emphasize self-education. It's about going beyond just the headlines and sound bites, Read deeply, explore different viewpoints, be critical of the information that you encounter.
Yeah, especially online.
Especially online.
So easy to get caught in those echo chambers
Yeah.
where you only hear what you already agree with.
Make a conscious effort to engage with perspectives that challenge your own views. It's not about agreeing with everything you hear, but understanding the other side of the argument.
Right.
That's how you sharpen your critical thinking skills.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
You need that friction of different ideas to really test your own.
Right.
So, but what about beyond reading and researching? How do we tackle this tendency towards scapegoating that the author talks about? I mean, that happens in everyday conversations, not just in the political speeches.
Yeah, that's where that self-reflection comes in.
Okay.
The author highlights this human tendency to want to blame the other for our problems.
Yeah,
So take a moment to examine your own biases. I
Right.
mean, we all have them as part of being human,
of course.
but recognizing them is the first step towards making sure that they don't control your actions.
So if you find yourself, making a sweeping generalization about a group of people,
Pause.
Right.
Ask yourself, is this based on facts and evidence, or is this based on stereotypes and assumptions? Challenge those thoughts.
and if you hear someone else doing it,
Don't let it slide.
okay,
Politely but firmly challenge those statements. Ask for evidence. Point out the flaws in their logic. Silence in the face of prejudice just allows it to grow stronger.
yeah, for sure. We also talked a lot about this idea of collective amnesia. How do we ensure that we don't fall into that trap of forgetting the past, especially those difficult parts of history?
I think the author seems to believe that actively engaging with history is key.
Yep.
And I don't mean just memorizing dates and names,
Well-
but really understanding the context,
Right.
the human stories,
Yeah.
the choices that led to both the triumphs and the tragedies.
So visit museums, read historical accounts, talk to people who have lived through those significant events.
Exactly. And support institutions that are working to preserve historical memory. Libraries, archives, museums, historical societies.
Yeah,
These places play a vital role in ensuring that the past is not forgotten.
they really do. The author also emphasizes the importance of active participation in the democratic process. And I think sometimes people feel like their vote doesn't matter or that politics is just too messy to get involved with.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
Yeah.
Apathy is a luxury we can't afford.
Right.
Democracy thrives on participation, not passivity.
Right.
So vote in elections, stay informed about local and national issues,
Yeah.
engage in civil discourse, and hold your elected officials accountable.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming, like our individual actions don't really make a difference.
Mhm.
But this source seems to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, it's like that quote about the starfish.
Oh, yeah.
Where this young person is throwing starfish back into the ocean one by one,
Right.
and somebody asks, what difference does it make? There are thousands of them. And the young person replies, it makes a difference to this one.
Yeah, I love that story.
Our individual actions might seem small, but they can have a ripple effect.
I think this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
You did.
And hopefully it's done the same for our listeners. It's easy to feel kind of discouraged by the state of the world.
Yeah, I get that.
But we're not powerless.
No, we're not.
The author ends the piece with a really poignant line. They say, "We want to believe that the other is to blame for our personal misfortunes. It's a reminder that scapegoating is a powerful human tendency,
Right.
but not an inevitability.
Yeah.
We have the power to choose differently.
We do.
You can choose to confront our own biases,
Yeah.
to embrace complexity,
Absolutely.
to see those different from us not as threats, but as fellow human beings worthy of respect and dignity."
That's a powerful message to carry with us.
It really is.
So as you go about your day, just ask yourself, what small act of awareness, of resistance, of compassion can I do today to build a better world?
That's a great question for everyone to consider.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Of course. It's always great to be here.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep learning.